Number 11. Crooked California Cops. In 2016, a troubled young prostitute from Richmond, California accused dozens of Bay Area police officers of utilizing her services in exchange for protection from legal trouble. Jasmine Abuzlin, also known as Celeste Guap, slept with as many as 29 cops from at least 6 different law enforcement agencies over a period spanning less than 2 years. The Oakland Police Department became the first agency to investigate following the death of 30-year-old officer Brendan O'Brien in 2015. O'Brien had left behind a note admitting to his inappropriate relationship with Abuzlin and even implicated several other officers for similar conduct. Multiple other agencies employing officers involved in the scandal also launched investigations, and Abuzlin eventually reported the misconduct. She was able to back up many of her claims with text messages and other evidence. And the evidence showed that she met up with officers at seedy motel rooms where she exchanged intimacy for cash, as well as information about upcoming vice raids and prostitution stings. Alameda County prosecutors charged 6 officers in connection with the scandal, including 5 Oakland officers, while many other suspects were never formally charged. In some cases, disciplinary action was taken internally, but many of the people involved kept their jobs. The cases against 3 of the criminally accused officers were dropped, while the 3 others took plea deals. Out of the 11 officers in Richmond who were implicated, 3 were fired while 2 quit voluntarily. At least 5 officers were reprimanded internally, and none were criminally charged. In June of 2017, Abuzlin was awarded a $989,000 civil settlement from the city of Oakland. She said she never expected anyone to care about prostitutes and that she looked forward to putting this chapter of her life behind her and moving forward. Number 10. Bridget Doucette Howell. In early 2022, 38-year-old Bridget Doucette Howell became the first ever New Hampshire school teacher to be charged with having inappropriate relations with a student who was legally an adult at the time of their interactions. According to prosecutors in Rockingham County, the misconduct took place over a several-week period, starting in late April of 2021. At the time, Doucette Howell was working as a drama coach at a high school in Kingston. She'd previously worked as a history and social studies teacher, but Doucette Howell was allegedly involved in at least 2 illicit encounters with a student, which took place in 2 separate locations. The former Teacher of the Year finalist was the first person to be charged under a new state law that had recently gone into effect shortly before her arrest. She now faces 3 felony aggravated assault charges and 1 felony assault count. Under the new legislation known as the Howell-Young loophole, it's a felony for any authority figure working in a school to have an inappropriate relationship with a student, even if the victim is over 18 years old. It's also illegal for educators to start romantic relationships with former students less than 10 months after the person graduates or leaves the school. The law even prohibits the accused from arguing in court that the victim consented to the relationship. The Howell-Young loophole was enacted after a teacher by that name was seen kissing an adult-age student in his car outside a high school in Concord. Prior to the new legislation going into effect, teachers could be fired for misconduct with a student who was 18 or older, but it wasn't considered a crime. Because Leung's relationship with the victim began at a younger age, authorities were still able to pursue a criminal case against him, and as a result, he was sentenced to prison. But lawmakers wanted to make sure that prosecutors would be able to hold suspects responsible in cases that don't involve minors. The outcome of Doucette Howell's case will offer some useful insight into the Howell-Young loophole's effectiveness in court. She was scheduled to go on trial in October 2023, but the proceedings were postponed when she expressed an interest in a plea deal. According to the most recent updates on the case, plea negotiations appear to be ongoing. Number 9. Ronald Evans. British murderer and serial attacker Ronald Evans is the United Kingdom's longest-serving prisoner. He was first jailed in 1963 when he received a life sentence for assaulting and killing a 21-year-old shop worker from Nottingham named Kathleen Heathcote. Evans was released on lifetime probation in 1975 after serving just 11 years behind bars. Then, over a 2-year period starting in 1977, he terrorized at least 7 women in the Bristol suburb of Clifton in a series of brutal assaults. According to authorities, Evans targeted women who were alone at night and seemed to be defenseless. He was then sent back to prison in 1979 and remained there until 2018, when he was released on lifetime probation after serving sentences totaling 57 years. The 82-year-old struck again, though, in 2022, when he allegedly victimized a woman he met while volunteering at a community center in London. According to prosecutors, Evans targeted the victim due to her physical disabilities and mental health struggles. She also had a history of suffering from domestic abuse, which made her particularly vulnerable. The woman started talking to Evans because she was lonely and wanted friends. And after eating at a pub one day, Evans convinced a woman to go back to his house with him, where he immediately began acting perverted. He told the woman he was receiving spam emails with explicit photos and proceeded to show her the images. Evans then started touching the woman, who said that she wanted to go home and got up to leave. But as she headed toward the door, Evans allegedly grabbed her backside. The next day, the woman told Evans that his behavior made her uncomfortable. He didn't seem particularly remorseful, though, and was arrested the following month. Evans was found guilty of assault and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was also ordered to pay financial compensation to the victim. Number 8. Heather Presti. As a registered nurse, Heather Presti took an oath to never harm her patients. But she did the exact opposite, according to prosecutors in Butler County, Pennsylvania, who are accusing the 41-year-old of killing 4 of her patients and injuring several others with high doses of insulin. According to court documents, Presti fell under suspicion after a victim's relative complained that the nurse was improperly administering insulin to her patients. Presti allegedly administered the deadly injections during overnight shifts at one of the 5 different care facilities she worked at over a 3-year period starting in 2020. Then in May of 2023, she was charged with killing 2 patients and injuring a 3rd. One of the patients Presti is accused of murdering was a 55-year-old man who died in early December of 2022. The other alleged murder victim was an 83-year-old man who died several weeks later on Christmas Day. A 73-year-old man survived an insulin overdose after being rushed to the hospital, but only one of the 3 men was diabetic and required insulin, according to State Attorney Michelle Henry. During questioning, Presti allegedly told investigators that she thought her patients had a low quality of life and that they'd be better off dead. She reportedly admitted to giving the victims insulin with the hope that they'd slip into a coma and die. Presti also claimed that the patient who survived had asked her to kill him, and she acknowledged that she watched him become symptomatic without seeking any help for him. In November 2023, 6 months after her first arrest, Presti was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 17 counts of attempted murder, and 19 counts of neglect of a care-dependent person. According to authorities, 17 of the patients Presti cared for between 2020 and 2023 passed away, and only some of the patients, who ranged in age from 43 to 104 years of age, were diabetic and required insulin. Presti is accused of mistreating 22 patients in total. However, she allegedly confessed to trying to kill 19 patients at various nursing homes and rehabilitation centers. In a statement announcing the charges, Pennsylvania State Attorney Michelle Henry said that the attempted murder charges apply to patients who either survived insulin overdoses or whose cause of death was undetermined. The disgraced former healthcare worker's history of abusive behavior dates back even further than the period of time covering her criminal charges. She worked at 11 different employers between 2018 and 2023, and she appears to have an established pattern of quitting or being fired due to conflicts with co-workers and patients. According to the New York Daily News, Presti allegedly sent text messages to her mother on numerous occasions, describing her desire to hurt co-workers, patients, and others who were frustrating her. Presti is currently being held without bail as she awaits the next steps in her case. Her attorney told the Associated Press that the accused killer is cooperating with prosecutors in an effort to avoid the death penalty. Number 7. Demetrius Barry. Ali Hayes was 18 years old, and therefore a consenting adult, when a man persuaded her to send explicit images over the internet in 2018. But she has Down syndrome, and her parents were shocked to discover that their vulnerable daughter had been victimized inside their Troy, Michigan home, a place that had previously felt safe from predators. Dawn and Mark Hayes called the police, hoping that the perpetrator would be held accountable for his actions. They believed that the suspect, Demetrius Barry, knew that their daughter had developed mental disabilities when he coerced her into sending him the pictures. Investigators agreed that the young woman had been exploited, but because she was legally an adult, the photos were considered consensual. But authorities charged Barry with using a computer for immoral purposes under an obscure law that's hardly ever enforced. As a result, Barry spent 6 days in jail and was sentenced to probation. He was also ordered to perform community service and undergo a mental evaluation. To the Hayes family and their supporters, this was a far cry from justice. They didn't want to see anyone else go through a similar situation, so they campaigned relentlessly for a new state law that would allow harsher punishments for predators who target vulnerable adults over the internet. Also known as Justice for Ali, the proposed policy could close the legal loophole that prevented authorities from charging Barry with a more serious crime. And more specifically, the legislation would make it a felony to coerce a vulnerable adult into sending explicit images or videos, allowing for a maximum punishment of up to 2 years in prison. In October 2023, the 2 bills encompassing the law passed unanimously in the State House, and it will now head to the Senate for further approval. Number 6. Rachel Lee and Porsche Lee. Ralph Raines Jr. is a simple man who grew up on his family's 1,200-acre timber farm in Gaston, Oregon. He developed a passion for tree farming, but had no interest in the financial aspect of running the business. In fact, he was unaware of just how wealthy his family was and didn't fully understand the value of the $10 million in assets that he stood to inherit once his parents passed away. Raines was also a socially awkward loner and a lifelong bachelor who longed for companionship and a family of his own. In 2004, he turned to a psychic named Rachel Lee in search of spiritual guidance and answers about his future. By then, Ralph was in his 50s, and his desire for a wife and children was stronger than ever. So he confided in Rachel, and in doing so, he provided details that made her realize he was worth a lot of money. As their friendship grew, Raines became increasingly generous towards Rachel. In 2006, he bought her a house valued at $915,000, despite living in a ramshackle home himself. Ralph was so thankful to have Rachel in his life that he didn't mind spending money on her, and he was also okay with overpaying her to the tune of $9,000 per month when he hired her as a caretaker for his aging father. Rachel eventually convinced Ralph to give her complete legal control over his finances. She claimed to be an experienced bookkeeper who would manage and invest Ralph's money wisely, but in reality, she did the exact opposite. Almost immediately after becoming Ralph's power of attorney, Rachel began siphoning money from his accounts and moving it into her name. She bought multiple properties, including 4 psychic shops, and this was just the beginning of the literal fortune she'd go on to squander. In 2007, Rachel and her daughter Porsche hatched an unthinkable plot to further the scam by deceiving Ralph into thinking he'd met his dream woman. Donning a blonde wig and sporting a fake British accent, Porsche crossed paths with Ralph at an airport and introduced herself as an accountant named Mary Marks. Not realizing that the woman was Porsche in disguise, Ralph was smitten. After all, pretty blondes were his weakness. Mary never lived with Ralph or had physical relations with him, but she procured bogus paperwork to convince him that they were married. She also convinced Ralph that she'd gotten pregnant with his biological son using a sperm sample she asked him for. But in reality, Porsche faked the pregnancy, and the little boy she touted as her and Ralph's son was actually her nephew. Ralph never questioned whether he was the father, though. He was thrilled to finally be a dad and loved the child unconditionally. Unfortunately, Ralph's soft spot for his make-believe wife and son only opened more doors for Porsche and Rachel when it came to stealing his fortune. They bought luxury cars and jewelry, went on lavish vacations, purchased more properties, and blew copious amounts of money gambling. And when the money in Ralph's account started to run low, the women started selling off portions of his tree farm. The scheme finally fell apart in 2014 after police saw a Ferrari parked outside Rachel Lee's psychic shop and began to wonder how she paid for it. Then, following an investigation, authorities charged Rachel, Porsche, and Rachel's husband, Blancy Lee, on a slew of fraud and theft-related charges. Ralph Rains was devastated to learn that the last 7 years of his life with Mary Marks had been a lie. But by then, his scammers had sold most of his tree farm, and he had just $200,000 left to his name. The Lees took deals and pleaded guilty to reduced charges, which landed Rachel Lee behind bars for 8 years, while Porsche was sentenced to 33 months. Blancy, on the other hand, received a 2-year term. Ralph will never recover all of his lost assets, but he's mostly upset that he lost the illusion of a family that he'd grown to love. In 2015, he told ABC News that he wasn't angry at the con artists and that he hoped they'd do well in life after serving their time. Number 5. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell. Meeting someone through a dating app comes with unavoidable risks, but it can be especially dangerous for people who let their guard down easily. Such was the case for 24-year-old Sydney Loof, who was eager to get back into the dating game amid a years-long battle with depression. Sydney worked as a cashier at a hardware store in Lincoln, Nebraska. She lived roughly 3 hours away from her family, but kept in close touch with them, and she tried her best to maintain a positive attitude despite her mental health struggles. Then, just days after going on antidepressants in 2017, she made plans to meet up with a woman she'd connected with on Tinder named Audrey. Her friends would later recall how excited she was about the date, and how she'd even shown them pictures of Audrey. The first date went well, and the two women made plans to meet up again a few nights later. But Sydney left for the second date and was never seen or heard from again. When she failed to show up at her job the next morning and wasn't answering her phone, her parents drove to her apartment. They didn't find any direct evidence of foul play, but they knew something was seriously wrong. Sydney's car was in the driveway, yet the young woman was nowhere to be found, and her cat was hungry. Things she would have normally taken with her, including her purse and glasses, had been left behind at the apartment. The family filed a missing persons report and investigators got to work. In the meantime, one of Sydney's friends scrolled through Tinder pictures until they found Audrey. They messaged her and she replied with her phone number, which the friend then passed on to the police. A few days later, police discovered that Sydney's phone had last pinged at a residence roughly 35 miles away in Wilbur. The address belonged to Audrey, whose real name is Bailey Marie Boswell, and the 23-year-old's much older boyfriend, 51-year-old Aubrey Trail. On the same day Sydney went missing, the couple's neighbors noticed an overwhelming odor of bleach coming from their basement. The smell was so strong that it caused the neighbors to throw up and break out in hives. They also noticed that Boswell and Trail had their air conditioner running, even though it was cold outside. Armed with a search warrant, police visited the property. They failed to find any suspicious evidence, but they noticed a bleach smell and nobody was home at the time, leading them to suspect that Boswell and Trail had gone on the run. The couple broadcasted videos on social media, maintaining their innocence. Boswell claimed that she and Sydney had driven around and smoked weed on their second date and that she dropped Sydney off at a friend's house. She and Trail refused to disclose their whereabouts, but they were tracked down at a motel in Branson, Missouri, roughly 2 weeks after Sydney vanished. They were picked up on an unrelated fraud case and were held in custody while the search for Sydney continued. 5 days later, a search team found Sydney's dismembered remains along a gravel road, roughly an hour away from where Boswell and Trail lived. She'd been chopped up into 14 pieces and discarded in garbage bags along with handcuffs, rope, a dog collar, and other fetish items. After initially denying any involvement in Sydney's murder, Aubrey Trail claimed that he'd accidentally choked the victim to death during a threesome with her and Boswell. He gave some valuable information, but changed his story several times. Trail insisted that Boswell wasn't involved in the crime, but investigators believed he was trying to protect her from legal consequences. Both suspects were ultimately charged with first-degree murder, improper disposal of human remains, and conspiracy to commit murder. Surveillance footage from the days leading up to Sydney's murder showed Trail and Boswell buying a folding saw, a hacksaw, a utility knife, bleach, garbage bags, a garbage can, and other suspicious items. Cell phone data revealed that the couple had followed Sydney to her workplace, where Trail was seen staring over his shoulder at Sydney. During the trial, several witnesses testified that Trail and Boswell had a specific desire to film a video of themselves torturing and killing someone. Known as snuff films, these gruesome recordings are known to fetch high profits on the black market. Based on the evidence, which included ciphered jailhouse letters Trail had sent to Boswell, prosecutors argued that the couple had lured Sydney to her death by preying on her desire for companionship and taking advantage of her unsuspecting nature. Both defendants were found guilty as charged, and Trail was sentenced to death, while Boswell received a life sentence with no chance of parole. In August 2023, Trail filed court paperwork stating that he had no plans to utilize his death penalty appeals. He even asked the state of Nebraska to set an execution date and to speed up the process of carrying out his punishment. Number 4. Jesse Kurczewski. During the early evening hours one day in October 2018, 37-year-old Jesse Kurczewski dialed 911 and reported that her friend, Lynn Hernan, wasn't breathing. A deputy responded to the Milwaukee, Wisconsin home, where he found Herman lying unresponsive in a recliner with crushed-up medication and a large number of pill bottles nearby. And unfortunately, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Kurczewski identified herself as a family friend and Hernan's sole caregiver. She told investigators that Hernan struggled with addiction and health problems, and that she stopped at home to check on the woman multiple times daily. At first, it seemed entirely plausible to think that Hernan may have died from an overdose. She had no contact with her family and lived an isolated and depressing existence toward the end of her life, according to Kurczewski, who claimed to be the woman's only friend. Kurczewski said that Hernan was sick of being sick and told police that Hernan's behavior became increasingly unusual in the week leading up to her death. She also described Hernan as a heavy drinker who was often noticeably intoxicated. But there were people who cared about Hernan, contrary to Kurczewski's claims, and they were quick to tell detectives that they suspected foul play. They didn't believe that Hernan would overdose on accident or on purpose, and they were especially alarmed to learn that Hernan had supposedly left her entire estate to Kurczewski. A relative urged the Waukesha County Medical Examiner's office to look for signs of a suspicious death and to make sure Hernan's will was authentic. Toxicology results revealed that Hernan died from a fatal overdose of an eye drop ingredient called tetrahydrozoline. There was too much of it in her system for her to have ingested it through her eyes, indicating that the toxic substance had been slipped into her food or drink. As investigators continued to question Kurczewski, they noticed that she kept changing her story and that the details just didn't add up. Kurczewski claimed that Hernan suffered from chronically dry eyes and used a lot of eye drops, but the medical examiner said that it wasn't normal for someone's blood to contain a detectable amount of tetrahydrozoline. The medical examiner also told detectives that Kurczewski showed a suspicious amount of interest in the results of Hernan's autopsy and that she'd called the office repeatedly asking for the toxicology results. Further investigation yielded strong evidence that Kurczewski had stolen upwards of $290,000 from Hernan's financial accounts over a 2-year period, and that she'd gambled the money away. As a result, she was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of felony theft. Kurczewski maintained her innocence throughout her trial, arguing through her attorney that Hernan just happened to enjoy spiking her own drinks with eye drops. The prosecution accused Kurczewski of taking advantage of Hernan's financial vulnerability and acting purely out of heartless, self-serving greed. In November 2023, a jury found her guilty on all counts. She faces a mandatory life term and is currently awaiting sentencing. Number 3. Trav Gains. A St. Louis, Missouri woman was waiting for a food delivery one day in October 2023 when her DoorDash driver allegedly barged into her home unannounced and assaulted her. She was only wearing a towel when the suspect forced his way inside, yanked the towel off her body, and grabbed her chest. The woman managed to escape and ran to a neighbor's house where she dialed 911, but the suspect fled the scene. A few minutes later, the victim received a FaceTime request from an unknown number. She later told police that it was the DoorDasher and that he was touching himself inappropriately in front of the camera. Officers then located the suspect, 23-year-old Trav Gains, with help from DoorDash. And according to a police report, he slipped out of his handcuffs during the arrest and attempted to drive off in his car. Gains allegedly ignored repeated commands to stop what he was doing and tried shifting the car into drive until officers subdued him. He now faces multiple charges, including burglary, resisting arrest, and several counts relating to the actual attack. The disturbing incident served as a reminder that almost anyone can sign up to be a driver for a food delivery app. Speaking with local station KSDK, security expert Mike Barbieri advised members of the public to choose a contactless delivery when possible and to retrieve the food after the driver leaves. In a statement, DoorDash reassured its customers that it doesn't condone the suspect's alleged actions and that it was cooperating fully with law enforcement. And while it's unclear whether Gains has any prior convictions, the company is known for hiring felons on a case-by-case basis and has come under criticism in the past for allegedly allowing dangerous people to work as door dashers. In a lawsuit filed in 2019, a Las Vegas restaurant owner named Fabio Coppola accused DoorDash of being negligent in its decision to hire Mackie Lee Allen, a convicted felon with a history of mental health problems. Allen stabbed Coppola with a pocket knife in an unprovoked attack while picking up a customer's food order at Coppola's restaurant. The lawsuit alleged that DoorDash falls short of its duty to protect its customers' safety by utilizing the services of a background check service that only looks at the most recent 7 years of a candidate's legal history. Unfortunately, though, not much seems to have changed when it comes to the company's policies and its willingness to hire people with troubling records. Number 2. Anna Bonner. Sue Hughes is a naturally trusting person who hoped to find love after spending most of her adult life single. While working as a nurse in Liverpool during the late 90s, she became best friends with a co-worker named Anna Bonner. The women quickly developed an inseparable bond, and eventually they became roommates. During a girls' night out in 1998, Sue instantly became infatuated with an attractive bouncer at a club where she and Anna were drinking. Anna claimed that the bouncer was her Uncle Stair, and Stu's crush on the man only grew during the handful of times that the women crossed paths with him before the club shuttered its doors. It was usually too loud in the club for Sue and Stair to talk for very long, but Sue felt chemistry between them. She was disappointed when the club closed, though, effectively ending her face-to-face encounters with Stair. For more than a decade, her contact with her love interest was limited to occasional text messages that Stair sent to Anna's phone and letters exchanged through the mail. And although they had no in-person relationship, Sue was happy to buy Christmas and birthday gifts for Stair, with Anna acting as the middleman delivering the presents. But out of nowhere in 2011, Sue received a phone call from Stair. He claimed that he was living in the United States and was doing well, and he also expressed his desire to stay in touch. Stair asked Sue to buy him an expensive camcorder for Christmas. It was a lot more money than she normally spent on him, but she managed to scrape up the necessary funds for the gift. Later that year, Anna told Sue that Stair had moved back to Liverpool and was working as a bouncer at a club. So Sue visited the club, but she couldn't find Stair. 4 years later in 2015, the club was raided by law enforcement. Anna told Sue that Stair had been arrested for drugs and that he'd been sentenced to time in prison. She also said that he needed money to stay financially afloat while he served his time, and as usual, Sue was happy to help out. It wasn't long before Anna claimed that Stair had been released but had moved back to America to receive treatment for an aggressive form of cancer. The treatment was extremely expensive but necessary to save Stair's life, according to Anna, who asked Sue to help foot the bill. Sue agreed to pitch in £500 per month towards Stair's medical bills. But over time, the amount grew to £1,800, and Anna frequently asked Sue for additional payments outside the monthly installments. The expenses became incredibly difficult to keep up with, but Sue valued Stair's life far more than any dollar amount. But no longer able to afford her own living expenses and Stair's medical bills out of pocket, she began borrowing money and went deeply into debt. When Sue ran late on payments, Anna pressured her to hurry up and come up with the money so Stair could get his cancer treatment. In the meantime, Sue and Stair exchanged letters and gifts through the mail, with Anna once again acting as the intermediary who delivered the items during her visits to the US. From the outside looking in, something clearly wasn't right about the situation, but Sue kept her financial problems a secret from her family and friends, who would have likely tried to intervene if they'd had the chance. Sue finally started to catch on that Anna was a complete fraud in 2019, when she realized that her bestie was staying at a home just a few miles away when she claimed to be in the US visiting Stair. Anna's estranged husband exposed the truth in early 2020 when he gave Sue a pile of letters she'd written to Stair that were never delivered. It finally dawned on Sue that the bouncer she fell head over heels for wasn't Anna's uncle, and and that Stair wasn't even a real person. She soon discovered that Anna had been living off her money for years while pretending to work at a hospital. Authorities charged Anna with fraud and accused her of stealing £117,239 from Sue. She was found guilty, and as a result, she was sentenced to 28 months in prison. Unfortunately, though, the punishment does little to repair the financial and emotional damage that Sue continues to suffer after being deceived for the better part of 2 decades. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. Jeffrey O'Brien. On May 1st, 2023, 29-year-old Jeffrey O'Brien knocked on an elderly stranger's door in the English town of Bedlington. He told the senior citizen, who's in her 90s, that he'd cleaned her gutters and ordered her to pay him for the unsolicited services. O'Brien also asked the woman for a glass of water, which she went to retrieve while leaving her front door open. O'Brien then slipped inside uninvited and made off with the woman's purse and wallet. By the time the victim realized that she'd been robbed, O'Brien was long gone from the scene and had used one of her bank cards to buy cigarettes. The suspect was still at large 3 days later when he approached a woman who was walking alone and snatched her purse, nearly shoving her to the ground before he ran off with the stolen property. Police identified O'Brien as the suspect in both cases after the second theft was reported. He was quickly captured and was charged with burglary, robbery, and fraud by false representation. O'Brien pleaded guilty as charged in October 2023 and was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. The court also issued 7-year protective orders for both victims and insisted that O'Brien financially compensate both women for his crimes. Following the sentencing hearing, Northumbria burglary detective Jude Scott described the convicted thief as a persistent and remorseless offender who targets women that he knows he's capable of manipulating and overpowering. Scott commended the victims for diligently coming forward and immediately reporting O'Brien's crimes, which helped the police get him off the streets before he could harm anyone else.
8. Eli Weaver and Barbara Rayber. Murders are extremely rare, if not unheard of in Amish communities, which is why people were shocked when a well-liked mother of 5 named Barbara Weaver was murdered at her home in Apple Creek, Ohio in 2009. One of Barbara's children had found her unresponsive in bed and alerted a neighbor who went to the community's phone booth and called the police. Someone had fatally shot the 30-year-old in the chest. Detectives found cash in several parts of the home, ruling out robbery as a motive. At the time, Barbara's husband Eli was on a fishing trip. Law enforcement tracked him down through one of his non-Amish friends, who had a cell phone, and they brought him in for questioning. Eli insisted that he had no involvement in his wife's murder, but he remained a suspect. Barbara's sister told police that Eli had a history of cheating with women outside the Amish community. He had moved out twice due to his affairs and was shunned from the local church, but had earned forgiveness from the church elders upon his return. As a devout member of her faith, Barbara didn't see divorce as an option, so she chose to forgive her husband. According to her sister, Barbara had become suspicious that Eli was cheating on her again in the months leading up to the murder. Eli swore that his cheating days were over, but in the days following the murder, people saw him spending a lot of time with a married Mennonite woman named Barbara Rayber. Mennonites live a strict, old-fashioned lifestyle, but are allowed to have modern conveniences like cars, phones, and electricity. Rayber often worked as a hired driver for the Amish, so her presence in the community was normal. But her interactions with Eli seemed to suggest that their relationship was deeper than business. During questioning, Rayber admitted to having an affair with Eli, but insisted it had ended months earlier. Another mistress, Dandy Heasley, said she met Eli on a dating website, leading to investigators to discover that he had a secret cell phone. In his dating profile, he described himself as an Amish stud and posted shirtless photos of himself. And apparently, his profile appealed to a lot of women, many of whom came forward to report that Eli had frequently talked about being miserable in his marriage and wanting to have his wife killed. Heasley helped police get the number to Eli's secret phone by reaching out to him online and telling him to call her. Phone records revealed that Rayber was paying for the phone, and she and Eli were still entangled in an affair. Eli had convinced his mistress that their relationship could only continue if Barbara died, and they talked at length about the best ways to kill her. In the end, they were each charged with murder. Eli took a plea deal and admitted to complicity to commit murder in exchange for a 15-year prison sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in 2024 at the age of 44. Rayber turned down a plea deal and went to trial despite having admitted to the crime during questioning and was found guilty of aggravated murder. She was sentenced to life in prison and will become eligible for parole in 2032. 7. Hayley Littlefield and Logan Runyon. When 46-year-old Francis Kelly from Indiana failed to pick up his daughter on his birthday in January 2021, the girl's mother, Courtney, became concerned. She called the police, who knocked on Kelly's door and left after receiving no response. Courtney then went to the house herself and found him dead on his couch. An autopsy concluded that Kelly was strangled to death. He also had blunt force trauma injuries and fentanyl in his system. Investigators searched the phone of Hayley Littlefield, another ex-girlfriend of Kelly's, who he was entangled in a child custody dispute with at the time of his murder. They were to go to court just days after he was killed to sort out a complaint Kelly had made about Littlefield refusing to let him pick their child up and insisting on staying at his house during visits. In a text conversation from 3 days before his body was found, Kelly accused Littlefield of tampering with his oatmeal when she was at his house the night before. He said he took a few bites and that the food tasted funny, and that shortly afterward he started to feel lightheaded. But Littlefield acted like she didn't know what Kelly was talking about. Just days into the investigation, Littlefield's ex-husband revealed that her 22-year-old daughter, Logan Runyon, had told him that her mum had paid her boyfriend, Robert Walker, $2,500 to hire a hitman to kill Kelly. A relative of Littlefield told police that she had made several bizarre statements after the murder, including that Kelly was better off dead, and that she might as well say she killed him because she was crazy and pregnant. It was soon revealed that Runyon had accompanied her mother to Kelly's house the night before he ate the suspicious-tasting oatmeal. Another one of Littlefield's exes said she'd told him that Runyon put fentanyl in Kelly's oatmeal. After receiving the accusatory text from the victim, Littlefield and Runyon allegedly climbed into his home through a window and found him dying on the floor. The ex-boyfriend also claimed that Littlefield had asked him repeatedly in recent months about how much fentanyl it would take for someone to fatally overdose. Runyon testified against Littlefield as part of a plea deal and was sentenced to 26 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. She told the court that she and Littlefield poisoned Kelly's food on 3 separate occasions. Littlefield was found guilty of murder and several other charges, and received consecutive sentences totaling 115 years behind bars. Runyon's boyfriend, Robert Walker, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his involvement in Kelly's death. 6. David Love and Theresa Stone. 42-year-old Randy Stone was shot to death in cold blood at his insurance office in Independence, Missouri in 2011. As a devout Baptist churchgoer and married father of 2, he was a pillar of the community, so locals struggled to understand who might want to kill him. Randy and his wife Theresa had what seemed like a storybook marriage. It was clear to everyone who knew the pair that Randy was head over heels in love with his wife of nearly 20 years, and Theresa seemed to feel the same way about her husband. The couple's lives were centered around their faith, and they spent a lot of their free time at their church. Randy taught Sunday school, drove church buses, and acted as a financial advisor, and Theresa participated in church activities and sang in the choir. He was also best friends with the pastor of his church, David Love, who he looked to as a spiritual mentor. Love presided over Randy's funeral with a deeply moving and seemingly heartfelt eulogy. Meanwhile, investigators began to dig for clues in hopes of identifying the killer. A shell casing at the scene matched the type of Glock handgun Randy owned, which happened to be missing from his house. In Theresa's office garbage, they found a torn-up card or letter. Put together, the pieces revealed a handwritten message wishing her a happy birthday and stating, "I'm not in control of things yet, but when we're fully together, your birthday will always be exciting." Oddly enough, the handwriting didn't match up with Randy's. Theresa eagerly provided receipts and other evidence to confirm her alibi, but in the eyes of the investigators, she seemed a little too prepared to clear her name. But she was caught totally off guard when detectives asked her about the ripped note, and she didn't have an immediate answer. Investigators left her alone in the interrogation room for a few minutes, during which time she was captured on camera saying to herself, "Oh great, I forgot about that." She claimed the letter was from a secret admirer, but police didn't buy the story. Adding to their suspicion was the fact that Theresa had visited Randy's friend and colleague Robert Davis less than 24 hours after the murder to ask how long she had to wait for the $800,000 life insurance payout she was expecting. Detectives were especially intrigued by rumors of an affair between Theresa and Pastor Love, who was married with 3 children. They learned that Theresa had gotten pregnant and miscarried after Randy had a vasectomy. She eventually admitted that she and Love had been secretly seeing each other for 10 years and blamed him for Randy's murder, claiming she had no knowledge of or involvement in the crime. David Love pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence, with the possibility of parole starting in 2036. His wife has since divorced him and remarried. Theresa pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 8 years in prison as a result. 5. Stephen and Katie Plad. After struggling to raise a baby they weren't ready for, who was born in 1998, Stephen Plad and his wife, Alyssa, put their daughter up for adoption. The girl, named Katie, tracked down her biological parents in Henrico, Virginia in 2016. They reunited, and she eventually moved in with them and her siblings. But something seemed off to Alyssa about the relationship between her husband and Katie. The couple was having marital problems, and Stephen often slept on the floor of Katie's bedroom. Shortly thereafter, Stephen and Alyssa ended things and moved into separate residences. One day, Stephen handed Alyssa the diary of one of their children and said that the kid had been misbehaving. But when Alyssa read the journal, she found an entry stating that Katie was pregnant and that Steve was the father. He'd even encouraged his other kids to call Katie their stepmom. When Alyssa confronted Stephen, he allegedly admitted that he'd gotten Katie pregnant and said they wanted to marry each other. Authorities in Virginia soon caught wind of the incestuous relationship and launched an investigation. When they caught up with Stephen and Katie in 2017, the couple had a baby with them. One of Katie's Instagram posts revealed that she and Stephen had gotten married in a simple wedding. However, they'd lied and said they were unrelated. The two were charged with incest, adultery, and contributing to delinquency, and were extradited to Virginia. Shortly after the arrest, Alyssa told the press that she blamed Stephen for the unnatural affair. She even accused him of brainwashing and seducing their oldest daughter, and said that she believes Stephen gave her the diary because he was too much of a coward to tell her about the relationship and pregnancy directly. Stephen and Katie bonded out of jail, but were banned from going near each other by the judge overseeing the case. Custody of the child was awarded to Stephen's mother, and Katie moved back in with her adoptive family in New York State. Unable to cope with the changes brought on by the arrests, Stephen tracked Katie down and shot her dead in a blind rage. He also lost his own life as a consequence of his unchecked emotions, bringing a tragic end to a twisted love story that never should have happened in the first place. 4. Pamela Smart and William Billy Flynn. After graduating from Florida State University in 1989, 22-year-old Pamela Smart took a job as a media coordinator at a high school in New Hampshire. She'd married her husband, an insurance agent named Gregory, just months earlier. However, there were already problems in the relationship. Gregory had supposedly confessed to Pamela that he had a one-night stand, leaving her self-esteem shattered. Ironically, she was running a program at the school where she worked called Project Self-Esteem, which is where she met a student volunteer named William Billy Flynn. Pamela and the younger student then began a steamy affair that ultimately led to tragedy. One afternoon in 1990, Pam came home to find her husband dead on the floor in a pool of blood. He'd been shot in what initially appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong. During the investigation, the father of one of Billy's friends, Vance J.R. Latimer Jr., turned a .38 caliber pistol into the police, saying that he suspected it might be the murder weapon. Latimer, Billy, and another suspect, Patrick Pete Randall, eventually admitted to their roles in the murder. Billy claimed that Pamela threatened to end their affair unless he killed Gregory. He admitted to shooting the victim in the head while Randall held Gregory at knife point. Latimer drove the getaway car, and a fourth suspect, Raymond Fowler, was also said to be in the vehicle at the time. They all pointed at Pamela as the mastermind of the crime. Pamela's friend, Cecilia Pierce, wore a wire and captured recordings of her making incriminating statements and seemingly encouraging Pierce to lie to investigators. 3 months after Gregory was killed, Pamela was charged with first-degree murder for organizing the hit, even though she didn't pull the trigger and wasn't there when it happened. She claimed that she had tried to end her affair with Billy numerous times, but that he threatened to hurt himself if she broke up with him. Pamela also claimed that she didn't know about the plot to kill Gregory. The prosecution, on the other hand, depicted Pamela as a manipulative older woman who used her feminine wiles to persuade her teen boyfriend to murder her husband. Billy, Latimer, Randall, and Fowler cooperated against Pamela in exchange for lighter punishments. Billy and Randall pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were paroled in 2015, just days after the 25th anniversary of the crime. Latimer was convicted of being an accomplice to second-degree murder, and Fowler was found guilty of conspiracy and attempted burglary. In 2005, they were both paroled. Pamela was convicted of first-degree murder and is currently serving a mandatory life sentence without parole. She continues to maintain her innocence and was denied parole for failing to take responsibility for her actions. Her request for a commutation hearing was denied, and the Supreme Court upheld the decision. She's since exhausted all her options for a legal appeal. 3. Robert and Michael Beaver. During the late-night hours of July 22, 2015, 911 dispatchers in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, received a call from a young person who said that his brother was attacking their family. Officers arrived at the residence to find the front porch saturated in blood. Inside, they discovered a teenage girl clinging to life with multiple stab wounds and the survivor who had been left unharmed. The 911 caller and 2 of his siblings had been stabbed to death along with their parents, 52-year-old David Beaver and his 44-year-old wife, April. One of the survivors identified their brothers, Robert and Michael Beaver, as the killers. Shortly thereafter, police apprehended the 2 suspects in the woods behind their house. An investigation revealed that the brothers had planned the massacre well in advance and in great detail. And as a consequence, they were each charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Neighbors told the media that the Beaver family mostly kept to themselves. The kids were homeschooled, and they interacted so little with the community that many people had never even heard of them when news of the murders broke. Robert reportedly told authorities that he wanted to be remembered as a notorious serial killer. He said that he and Michael had planned to continue their murder spree until they'd killed at least 50 victims. The brothers craved attention and recognition, and they hoped to outdo some of recent history's most infamous mass killers, including the Columbine shooters and James Egan Holmes, who opened fire on a packed movie theater in Colorado during a Batman premiere in 2012. In the end, both defendants were convicted of murder. The judge overseeing the case sentenced Robert to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Michael was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 38 years. His earliest opportunity for freedom will come in 2056, when he'll be 57 years old. 2. Weldon McDavid and Diana Lovejoy. 47-year-old computer programmer Greg Mulvihill was an ordinary family man who was known for being mild-mannered and calm. He was an unlikely candidate for trouble, but he managed to find it one night in 2016 when he was shot in the chest on a remote trail in Carlsbad, California. At the time of the shooting, Mulvihill was with his friend, Jason Kovac, who was shot in the armpit and dialed 911. Miraculously, they both survived the ordeal. Kovac told prosecutors that Mulvihill had received a mysterious phone call earlier that night from someone claiming to be a private investigator. The caller said that they had important information about Mulvihill's soon-to-be ex-wife, Diana Lovejoy. When the men arrived at the designated meeting spot, they saw a man laying on his stomach in camouflage. When they realized he had a gun, they tried to run as he fired multiple shots in their direction. At first, Mulvihill and Lovejoy's relationship had seemed picture perfect. They met on a dating website in 2005 and clicked over their love for the outdoors. 2 years later, they were married. The couple bought a home, and in 2012, Lovejoy gave birth to a son. Things took a disappointing turn in 2014 when Mulvihill lost his job, leaving Lovejoy with the responsibility of being the household's sole breadwinner. Around that same time, Lovejoy began to suffer from chronic fatigue. She suspected that she had a chronic pain condition called fibromyalgia, and that her and Mulvihill's son suffered from kidney problems. To others, it seemed like she was being irrational, especially since she refused to have the boy looked at by a specialist. Lovejoy also accused Mulvihill of abusing her, which many people found hard to believe given his non-confrontational demeanor. The couple's problems strained their relationship past the point of saving, and eventually they separated. Their court battle became contentious as they struggled to reach an agreeable divorce settlement and to peacefully co-parent their son. They were in the finalizing stage of their divorce when Mulvihill was shot and had recently been granted 50-50 custody. The shooter was long gone by the time police arrived at the scene, and there were no shell casings left behind. However, officers found a towel soiled with fresh human feces, so they took it into evidence and sent it in for DNA testing. During the investigation, detectives learned that Lovejoy had been having an affair with her married shooting instructor, Weldon McDavid. She had started taking lessons from the former Marine sniper around the same time she began claiming that Mulvihill had brutally assaulted her, which law enforcement never found any evidence of. McDavid apparently believed the allegations though, and was furious about the recent custody ruling. The feces that had been tested turned out to be a DNA match for McDavid, leading authorities to suspect that he and Lovejoy had co-conspired to murder Mulvihill. They also found evidence that Lovejoy had paid McDavid $2,000 to carry out the hit. Lovejoy maintained her innocence throughout her trial. McDavid claimed that he was such a skilled shooter that he would have killed Mulvihill if he'd wanted to. Both defendants were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. The judge sentenced Lovejoy to 26 years to life, while McDavid received a sentence of 50 years to life. 1. Paula and Melissa Millard. During an evening out at a pub in the London suburb of Cheam on New Year's Eve in 2016, 22-year-old Paula Millard and her 49-year-old mother Melissa got into a brawl with a woman in her 40s. The victim was rushed to the hospital shortly before midnight after receiving multiple serious injuries to her face and wrist. 3 months later, authorities charged the Millards with causing grievous bodily harm in connection with the incident, which has been described as a brutal assault. In the end, the mother-daughter duo were each slapped with a 5-year prison sentence.
Would you rather end up $50,000 in debt over a scam, or spend 5 years dating someone who claimed they loved you, only to learn that they never had any serious plans for a future together? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.